Oh, that's bright. Oh. Alright, right back at it. Everything is where I left it. This is one day after the upload of the video. And it's exactly where I left it. I got some great comments from all of you. I'm really impressed by how most people reacted to that last video and the recommendations that were made. It's all great info. I don't want to tell you what I'm doing yet, but a lot of you are right on point. What I've got here is the cylinder head. We really didn't spend a whole lot of time with this. And so what I'm going to do is go through this thing and pull all the bits and pieces out of it and get a good look at everything, make sure it's all sealed up, get it cleaned up. And I don't know why there's all this deionized water under my, I don't know. Anywho, this is what the bolts look like when they came off the wire wheel. This is typical of what you'd see. Oftentimes there's oil and stuff on them and it gets kind of contaminated up in the wheel and you kind of see it burnished into the surface, but yeah. They cleaned up really nicely for the most part. There's a couple of them that have some like rust spots and stuff in there, and yeah, you see all that. In between the washers sometimes you'll find it, but today my goal is to get through the cylinder head and to get parts cleaned up to do the top half of the engine that we didn't look at in the last video. The reason the head is on its side is because the cams are still installed. You never want to set a cylinder head down flat on its deck if it has cams in it, because some of the valves will be protruding below the deck surface and you could damage them. I had some requests for a crescent wrench in the last video for the stuck bolts. I got a good laugh out of that. This is what a crescent wrench is for to me. There's a hex on each cam so you can hold it still while you blast the bolts off the cam gears with an impact. There's 24 12mm bolts that secure 12 cam caps for 2 camshafts. Math, I know. Do your best to keep these in order, but they're stamped to make them easier to identify. Just know that some days the stamping machine worked better than on others. I should have already taken the cam angle sensor off. Should have already done that. Should have long since done that. Removing these takes all the pressure off of the valve train and allows you to remove all the parts. It's step 1. Okay, step 2. Or 3 if you count the valve cover. Gotta remove the head. I could keep going. If you wanted to work upright, just set the head back on your block. I've already cleaned up the block and pulled the dowel pin, so that option's out for me. I was meticulous about keeping all the valve train parts together in previous videos. Because everything worn was going to get replaced, none of the wear that might be on any of these parts will be relevant to me. R8, D7, that's on the exhaust cam. I don't see any other markings. I got an R6 and an 07 on the intake cam. Got a 0 stamped on that side and 1B on this side. Yeah, I have no reason to believe they're not the original cams. I took the oil diverter off, gathered up the oil squirters and delicate bits from the block and set them aside with the head parts that we're about to clean. Next, I'm pulling all the hydraulic lash adjusters. I told you that I'm replacing these, but I'll still clean them up and check them out. I know you want to get a look at these delicate bits. Nope, you have to wait. Because I want to know how these valves are doing, I just did the mineral spirits thing to get all the oil out first. This wasn't a serious cleaning. A cylinder head whose valves are eaten by pistons probably has bad valve guides in it, but this one went 50,000 miles after it was put back together, so I have no reason to suspect that there's anything wrong with it other than one burnt-looking exhaust valve, right? Well, let's see. This is roughly the equivalent of carb cleaner. During the big demonetization scare that swept certain video hosts for random reasons, I used water for this demonstration as it was the least offensive liquid. Well, solvents are thinner, and the closer consistency you can get to air, the faster this test is going to go. I waited, and no leak from this crispy valve. Even its neighbor is fine. So, let's try this on hole number 2. Yep, toast. That didn't take any time at all. Now for hole number 1. That seems to be holding. 4. We got a gusher. Good gravy. So half the exhaust valves are bad. Here's a closer look at these. No burnt valves anywhere, apparently, because either both leak or both don't. This demonstrates a symmetrical kind of damage, more in line with the timing belt special. Even if attempts were made to repair the cylinder head, there may have been some damage that was missed. So this is exactly like a completely different kind of collision repair for me. It's unfortunate, but it's not the end of the world.
They don't look 160,000 miles old. I mean, this is a matching set of valves. Let's check out the intake valves, shall we? Give them the old how you doing. Compressed air can be your friend on this test. If the head looks oily and damp, and you're using carb cleaner or some other volatile solvent, blasting it with compressed air will dry everything out and help you spot the leak. If it's wet at all, whether it's oily carbon or whatever, just blast it with compressed air and it'll answer your questions immediately. So it's not just half the exhaust valves, it's also 6 out of 8 of the intake valves too. So the car was running fine on 6 out of 16 valves. Nice. That explains the long cranking starts. Maybe if I filled the washer fluid tank with oil and plumbed a pair of lines with check valves into the intake runners, I could pre-lubricate it before startup with a little squirt to boost compression and she'd be fine. I don't like cleaning oil off my windshield though. Like the mess that was on the outside of this block, I'm pretty sure that the kind of damage we find on each individual valve will be unique. The results may be the same, but the damage though. Jamie's cylinder head jig to the rescue again. Man, I love this thing. I could have done this in real time and made you spend 4 whole minutes and 14 seconds watching me complete this task, but I've showed it before in the Hyundai and GSX series. This thing just saves an immense amount of time and effort. Of course I've got another ice cube tray. I label it for intake and exhaust, mark the timing gear side of the head, and keep it oriented with the head while I work. Use a magnet for the valve keepers and it'll help prevent them from getting away. Since the Sterilite Model 7240 makes 16 ice cubes, there's a slot for every part. I found this head has shims under every single valve spring to compensate for a valve job. Well, when you cut a valve seat, the valve sits a little deeper in the head, and this decreases valve spring pressure unless you shim the valve springs by the amount you removed cutting seats. I'll keep the shims with these parts so that I can measure them all and potentially find other problems in case their sizes don't match. Seeing shims on every valve pretty much confirms that this head was repaired by someone that knew what they were doing. It appears to have received a complete valve job, and that's encouraging. And if that's the case, then why are 10 out of 16 valves leaking now, right? If something was overlooked, this is about when it's going to show up, 50,000 miles later. I stretch wrap all the valve train parts into the ice cube tray so that they all stay put, and then I make room for the next phase of pulling the valves out of this thing. Pizza box, of course. Look, this is just settled science for me now. It worked better than anything else I'd done before, so I stopped searching for a new solution that's better than this. I'll inspect these later. Why? Because I want to clean this cylinder head first. We're going to inspect clean parts when we're going to do this. Too many people over the years have told me to do this, and I've always been happy with mineral spirits and my little $20 siphon feed blowgun thing, but this is the code said Ultrasonic cleaner. They may really want to rethink their marketing for this product. I think this is too soon. It comes with a list of admonitions in case you have to be spoken to that way after spending $400 on this thing. This one's 30 liters. It said it was 24 by 12 by 8. Yeah, well those turned out to be outer dimensions, and they don't account for the 5/16 inch wall thickness on length and width, so it's a tad over 23 by 11. That's really what it is. It's 8 inches deep though. I like the basket thing, that's cool. It's got rubber feet to protect both parts. But now as I attempt to put the cylinder head that I intend to clean inside of it, I find that this measurement oversight to be a real problem. Not a huge one though. I can take 1.5 inches off the side of my cylinder head by pulling all the studs out of it. So bear with me a moment as I double nut and extract all of these. Of course, beating them with a hammer too is necessary. There, now it fits. I called this deionized water earlier. This is distilled water, really not too far off either way. It's just important not to use tap water with minerals in it, according to the instructions of the solvent that I'm going to mix up. I'm starting with 2.5 gallons. I'm using Master Fluid Solutions, Master Stages Clean, and I can't even say that last part, it's not in my vocabulary. I don't know what that says. You mix this 10-to-1 with distilled water for best results, so it makes 10 gallons. 1 quart is 1/4 of a gallon. And this mason jar just suits the perfect measurement for what we're starting out with. I do some really stupid stuff right off the bat. I dip the jar in the water and rinse off the solvent, handling it with bare hands. The minute that stuff hit the water, it's not water anymore inside the tank. This solution is recommended for use up to 71 degrees Celsius, which is 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It's water-based, but it's still extremely caustic. Heated solvents always work better than cold ones, so of course I bought an ultrasonic cleaner with its own built-in heater. The number on the left is what you want, and the number on the right is what it is. My ultrasonic cleaner is in Celsius, and that's going to make a whole lot of you happy. While the solvent preheats before the first use, let's take a look at the manual. Thanks for buying this. Read the manual or you'll die in a ball of fire. Plug it into the proper outlet only, you idiot. The controls will dissolve if you don't wipe up, because what do you want for $380 with a 30-liter capacity? Keep it grounded, don't go in dry. You have to fill it before you turn it on, and at least 2/3 of the way if you want heat, which I didn't do. Whoops. Wear earplugs, don't burn yourself, don't carry it around full. Use water-soluble solvents. If you put fuels in it, you're an idiot. I like my version better. It's still completely condescending, but it's shorter. Reading that made me feel a little bit depressed, but it helped me figure out that there were 3 power buttons on it. It is filled with boring admonition, and it was far too depressing. I only skimmed it, I admit. At least I'm safe enough to start turning it on now, though, right? I mean, we filled it and plugged it in already. Alright, I've already had about enough of that. This is super obnoxious. Now it's preheating. You can see the heating element starting to warm up now. About 10 minutes later, it seemed to be taking its job a little more seriously. I guess we'll put a lid on it to hold in whatever heat it can produce and check back in about an hour. It made it to 57 degrees.
1 hour later.
Well, the manual said it likes to operate between 40 to 60 though, so I guess I'll turn it down a bit for this. I don't necessarily need to do 70 for what I'm doing. I mean, I don't need to go for broke. I'm also not really all that interested in putting my cylinder head in here first to experiment with it either. Let's use a variety of some other parts first as a test, something less important, like, oh, I don't know, the main caps, the rear main seal cover, some bolts and fasteners, the timing gear parts. Let's just see what it does to a variety of materials at once first. That was neat. Of course, the crystal clear solvent immediately turns black and we'll never get to see it work again until the next batch is freshly mixed. It became immediately apparent that it's not full enough to do its job, so I added another 1.6 gallons of water and about 1/3 of a quart more solvent. That can be kind of dangerous, I mean, you know, depending on what you're using in here, but this isn't sulfuric acid, so I'm not going to kill myself with this.
Siri, set a
That
timer
should
for
do it.
25 minutes.
Man, it's loud in here.
You can't hear me. Set a timer for 25 minutes. Wow, just getting white noise.
I'm talking directly to a shotgun mic and you can barely hear me.
That's how powerful the ultrasonic waves are.
Wear hearing protection, or if you have tinnitus...
Alright, I'm out.
Siri and I had our little talk outside. We've been patching things up lately. Sorry, you didn't see me pull that one out. I lost a memory card. I have others. But we'll go back over the results from all this a little later in the video. I learned valuable things about wearing gloves, even handling the dried parts, which tells me that you should rinse these parts that come out of this thing or give them a thorough scrubbing with a wire brush. I don't know what got into me here, why I used a brass brush here on the mains. That was a mistake. Use steel brushes if you do a post-wash cleanup, otherwise it's going to discolor your parts. Overall, it did a great job, and now I know what to expect. Let's get to the main event, shall we? The cylinder head. I tied a couple of pieces of 10-gauge wire through the head bolt holes to keep the cylinder head lifted up off the bottom of the tank and the heating element. This works, but it could be dangerous if either one slipped out of your hands and you dropped it in here and splashed yourself. It would be smarter to do this in a way that lets you stand clear, but for the sake of progress, I was just really aware of this and was carefully terrible. And here we go. Man, that's obnoxious. Never fully got it up to temperature in that last batch, but, you know, the results were really good.
I don't know if you're as curious as I am about how this turned out, but I'm pumped to see this. The water's really black. There's a lot of oil on top. But first, before we go one step further, Jafro learned his lesson the hard way. Yes, sir. Went back inside the house and washed my hands quickly because the burn set in within probably a minute or two. And I'm an idiot for not doing this the first time, but let me be the example. Put gloves on before handling anything that comes out of this. Ooh, slippery. Hot part. Hot part.
Because the part's twice as hot as the room I'm in, it dries very quickly. I can see right away that it took about 90% of the carbon off without me ever having to do anything but push a button. 95% of it just by wiping it with a shop rag. There's no discoloration. It looks like a bare cast with only minor cleanup work needed here and there. This was the desired result. I tried to skim some of the oil off, and I got a little bit, but this bath is so hot that it's just rolling in here right along with the solvent off the heating element. It might be easier when it's colder. I'll try it later. You've seen the intake side of this head all along the way of this teardown since I first pulled it out of the car, and you know where it came from already. The lifter galleries are all really clean. The carbon in this exhaust port didn't stand a chance. This is a huge time saver, man. Here's the deck surface. The oil and the carbon are gone, sure, but there's still a whole lot of lead or graphite or whatever the composite gasket material is all made of. It's an ultrasonic cleaner, not a head resurfacer though. But like my earlier tests, which we'll get back to, I learned that some of these things need to be manually removed from the parts before they're put into the bath for best results. This cleaning method works great for most things, but some things you'll still have to do manually. And here you can see the insides of the injector bosses, a place where there's often a lot of funk built up. It really got into every single nook and cranny. Did a great job. I'm impressed. I'm going to do the same thing with a razor blade that I do to the block, the old vertical blade scrapage thing. If the solvent isn't going to cut all the way through it, then, this always will. And why not? Let's give everyone an example of what happens if you treat an aluminum part a second time. Let me be your guinea pig. It's too loud. Bye. Alright, I'm back. This time I dried and wiped up as much as I could before it evaporated from the hot part. I wiped out the valve ports, the intake and exhaust ports, the combustion chambers, and all the carbon is all gone, but this solvent is extremely caustic. There were places on the deck surface where a salt-like crystalline structure started forming, and I'd wipe it off and it would come back on the aluminum surface. I gave it another pass with the razor blade and was able to scrape the residue from it, and for safe measure I brushed this off the entire outside of the cylinder head casting. I cleaned up all the flange surfaces that I could, and I'm going to set this thing aside for now. I'm sure many of you wanted to see the crankshaft closer. This crankshaft's been through a lot already, but its measurements were all perfectly in spec when we checked them in the previous video. There appears to be a pattern worn on the number 1 journal that could be caused by that timing sprocket issue that we saw. The overall picture shows me that something other than oil flowed through the oil system here at some point, and we know all the bearings got hammered good when it ate the valve train, and yeah, there's bearing material on the crank journals and grooves here and there. But I think that'll all clean up pretty good. I got faith in it. Not too bad. Feels great. I'm talking about the seal bosses here. Just checking to see if I could feel a groove cut into it. It was a little bit more pronounced. I found lower mile crankshafts that were worse. Now let's do the fingernail test. I don't love it. Feels great. Great. I might give it a real light polish. It's not 100%, but I'd put it in the upper 90 percentile for a crank that's been through 159,000 miles. Really rather impressed with that. So I conclude that it needs a machine shop. There goes all the at-home garage build. You've had a great look at this thing in its brown, nasty before state. Let's see how a crankshaft does in the ultrasonic cleaner. I didn't really have a choice but to set this thing directly onto the bottom this time. I think if anything can handle that, a 6-volt crankshaft will. And thanks to movie magic, every time I start that ultrasonic cleaner, a half hour disappears that you don't have to suffer through. Hey, I was somewhere else too, so I didn't either. This is what came out. Notice the crankshaft isn't brown anymore. I took a cue from other parts that were cleaned up and used some gum cutter to clean all the acidic residue off the journals first. Still got the pistons here, and you can see how well these cleaned up with my efforts. I just pretty much wire brushed them. Let's clean some more stuff since we've got this bath rolling, see how far it goes. Got most of the carbon out. It did a pretty good job. The insides of it, you can tell because of the loose clearances how brown everything was inside the crankcase. And that's kind of typical of when rings get loose. There's a whole lot of blow-by, so all that carbon and stuff from the burning fuel kind of saps and gets all over everything inside of there. And it's not really any different inside the block either.
You can see all this is pretty well blackened. This is after a pass of the mineral spirits. There's been a little bit of oil drainage from the main gallery through the oil squirter holes, and that's kind of soaked back in a little bit, but she's pretty clean.
I'm disassembling nothing. Drop them in assembled and hit full send. A half hour later, I used a pint paint can and some clean distilled water to rinse these things off after the bath. The rings don't just feel clean, they feel slippery. It really did a number on the bearings. I did what I could to neutralize the acid, and it turned the water really funky fast. Keep that in mind as you're cleaning things. You could actually be depositing funk from the solution onto your parts if it dries on it. I feel like we've cleaned enough stuff to get close-ups of what we all came here for now. Enough different materials already. We did 2 cycles on the cylinder head, and now you can see a little bit more of the carbon missing from earlier. The ports came out very clean, but when you look across the cylinder head deck, aside from the carbon in the combustion chambers being completely gone, you can notice that there's little white dots all over it. I'll likely have to resurface it anyway, so this isn't that big of a deal, but this is why you need to thoroughly rinse everything that goes into the bath. There's plenty of meat left on this head based on the depth indicators cast right here into the head. You can see the bullseye marks. The middle is still plenty recessed, unlike my Hyundai head example. Let's take a slow motion tour around the deck, shall we? There's some flash that can be trimmed from the coolant ports to improve coolant flow to the head. I'll do that later. But you can see on the second bath, after the razor blade cleanup, that most of all the carbon and everything in the discoloration is gone. There's just impressions from the texture of the head gasket and the fire rings left behind. It looks pretty good overall. I spotted some fisheye dimples in the quench area from some kind of debris that went through the engine, and that'll disappear with the resurface too. This engine has lived a full life already, so I'm not surprised by any of this. There's a couple of oil return galleries that I can clean up, but nothing anywhere bad as in all of my other DSM cylinder heads. It either got cleaned out in the previous service, or Mitsubishi takes the JDM castings a little more seriously than their DSM counterparts. Either one are possible, I don't know. Again, the ultrasonic acid bath doesn't remove your gaskets. You gotta remove those first. Here's that rear main seal housing I promised earlier that we'd look at. The RTV. It's pretty much unaffected. Glued that gasket on good. The ultrasonic cleaner is not the way you remove that. The acid won't cut the RTV, but there's one really important thing I need to point out. My paws are all over the rear main seal housing, and look how clean my hands are. Aside from oil filter housings, the rear main seal cover is always the dirtiest, most disgusting part on the whole engine. It's got layers of seals, gaskets, sealant, retainer rings, has clutch dust on one side, the crankcases on the other. It gets caked up with all kinds of funk, and my hands are still clean. Just know that wherever there was RTV in your assembly, you need to go back and clean it out of there yourself. The ultrasonic cleaner's not going to do it for you, and that's just how it goes. You'll find it while doing your inspections, and it looks to me like this side's really taking a beating with whenever that big timing thing happened, man. Aside from 2 gashes on the side of number 1, even the number 2 cam journal has a shiny side on the bottom edge, so, they got loaded up pretty hard. There's also this little jewel over here where it looks to me like the rocker arm got fired out and munched by a valve spring. That looks rocker arm shaped to me. The valve stem seals are all still squishy. They might only be 50,000 miles old, but they're 2 decades old. Usually by now they crumble. The acid bath didn't affect them at all, just like the RTV. In fact, it seems to just have cleaned them all up really well. They look new again. Of course, I'll be replacing them anyway while I'm in here. I'm going to clean up the oil returns, the coolant passages, get the cracked part on the exhaust flange fixed. It's extra work, but it's really no big deal. I'll give the whole deck another pass with a razor blade, but you don't need to watch me do that again. Here you've got a close-up of the crank after the bath. With it all cleaned up, it's easy to see with your eyeballs that it does indeed need a polish. It wouldn't make sense not to if it's getting new bearings. But look at that forged casting. It's gray now. It's as clean as the day it was forged. Just in case you don't remember what it looked like before, let's put it back into the crankcase that had the same exact stain on it. I can't call this a patina. That implies that the metal is corroded. This was a stain. Seriously, look how funky that is. Look how clean that crank is now. As all of this proves, yes, ultrasonic cleaners with heated solvent works amazingly well. Thank you guys, I've got you. The suitcase handles are all part of the same casting as the block, and you can see they've just come as clean as a crankshaft. No rust, no scale, nothing. Easiest cleanup I've ever had to do to these things. But the ultrasonic cleaner doesn't do everything. Just like I showed with the gaskets and RTV, the bolts I put in here didn't clean up very well either. It only got the oil and the dirt off of it. It didn't do anything with the rust or the RTV on the oil pan bolts. The bolts that were installed on the inside of the engine look brand new, but it's no help for the oil pan bolts or anything that was on the outside of the engine. There are some things that this solvent can actually damage. Softer metals are more reactive with it, and the softer they get, the more they react. So maybe shorten your time up in the bath. But like with the bearings, you can look at that for an example. A half-hour hot wash left them completely etched and partly dissolved. That's too long for a part like this to stay in here. Well, let's face it, nobody's going to do this. You take your bearings out first. This was just a test. It's not just one of them that came out like that. They all pretty much did the same thing. Wherever you have extremely soft metals or two dissimilar materials that are assembled, you're going to have problems with this solvent. And it's because acids are salts. Think of salts as ions because they're all unstable. They're like seeds for oxidation.
It's not particularly good for them to do that, but you know what? I don't plan on using these anyway. I just want to show you what would happen if you left them in there and you didn't rinse these parts off. So it's not a good idea to put in an assembled piston and rod. It's not really that great of an idea to do that, you can see, because you can never really get all the acids out of there. Give everything a good bath and try to dilute this stuff as soon as you get it out. So, very caustic. And it's not great for aluminum parts. You can see some crystallization right there. So you got to neutralize that stuff when it comes out.
Best I can do is oil them up and keep them lubricated so that no oxygen, water, or humidity can get in there. And also keep them articulating so that those oxides don't continue to build up and so that they can be dissolved to work their way out in the lubricant. If they don't move freely, they're going to be a problem. This is one kind of thing that you could run into with this thing. Timing gear components. No change at all. They look exactly like the parts I put in there, just a little bit less dirt on the belt guide. Not one single change. Hardened steel. The head parts and delicate bits have been excluded from all the stuff that we've inspected until now. I think it's time we put this thing to task and really see what we've got. What's good and what's bad. It's pretty obvious how different this aluminum cast looks compared to the cylinder head we already cleaned. This is the same kind of staining that exists all throughout the inside of the head that's on these caps. See what I mean about bolts that are inside the crankcase? How corrosion free they are? They're the ones that aren't rusty. We'll put all these in here and see how they do. At this point, the bath is 3 days old. It's reheated twice. I thought oil would float to the top if it was cold, but clearly it broke it down and mixed itself in there really good. Skimming only seemed to remove some of the lighter dirt that floated to the surface, and dust from fallout in the room, stuff that landed in there. There's no oil floating in it. You know, it said it separated pretty good, but I had no luck. It's cold, so yeah, I have to reheat it. Here we go. Takes at least an hour to heat up if it's 2/3 of the way full. Again, thanks to Movie Magic, you don't wait. Can you imagine how many ads that would have been just to reheat this thing? We're going to do the cam caps, dowels, bolts, oil squirters, oil squirter valves, camshafts, oil diverter bolts, and roller rockers first. I like the capacity this thing has. It's smaller than the block, but so far everything else has fit beautifully. This is going to be the 6th cycle of this solvent. It's really funky now. When these parts come out, I'm going to have this little tub of water here to rinse all these parts out. In the future, I'll get another bin to do this kind of stuff in and bring more water with me. Perhaps add some soap to it. And then also just a clean water rinse afterwards, followed by an oiling station. That would be the best way to do it. You know, I'm just sharing my opinion and first experience with my new ultrasonic cleaner so you can see what happens and learn from my mistakes. I'm sure there'll be tons of great information about different solutions, preparations, washes, and other tricks discussed in the comments. No, I'm not putting gasoline in jars. If you've done a lot of this, please share your experience. These are the kinds of examples where the internet can make the world a better place. As I scrubbed all the parts down with my gloved hands and rolled all the rocker arm roller bearings around, a whole lot of these feel like they don't roll right. But anyway, we'll see what they're doing once we get a little oil back in there again. It's about $400 to replace them all, and if I have to do that, so I'd really like to save what I can. The cam caps, oil diverter, and the 27 bolts I put in here came out looking brand new again. And they should, because they're mostly steel parts and they've spent their entire lives bathed in oil. There should be no corrosion to have to remove. It's just the same exact stain that came right off the crank and all the other parts we've cleaned. Gone. It'll be a lot easier to inspect, but I want them cleaned and oiled as soon as possible. Aside from one groove, I didn't spot any repeating wear patterns on the cam lobes that would have indicated that the rollers were leaving any imprints. There's the rocker that left the one groove that I found on the camshaft. At least it was an even groove. Some of these didn't roll right. Most of those have bashed up rocker pads where they contact the valves. Just mangled. Of course, I knew that was coming earlier because some of the valve tips looked pretty rough, and I hope I have some spares to cover that. But these are toast. I'm going to clean up my mess and move these parts into the clean room for the next round of inspection. I didn't forget about the lifters. The majority of people complaining to me about the ultrasonic cleaner were doing so in my lifter cleaning video. These rusty, pitted old things are a waste of sound waves. They're first revision lifters, small hole, and the ends of them are just tore up and non-reflective. They're scarred all to daylights. Hey, I got a great idea. Let's break big chunks of carbon loose and then give them a tiny small hole to maybe escape from, possibly. 2 further revisions of these lifters were made over the years, and it doesn't make sense to put the ones the factory deemed inadequate back in it. So this is where they go. This is where they belong. I prefer a new set with the right oil flow and 0 years of funk. I'm running out of things to wash. I want to clean the oil pump and balance shafts in a fresh batch at a later time, but while I've got this thing rolling, let's see what it does with all the brackets. What can we put in here? The roll stop engine mounts, timing bracket, water pump support parts, all that in one shot. All the steel stuff is clean, and it's taking the paint off. I find this to be a desirable result since I planned on repainting all this anyway. This will save me some time with stripping. How about that crusty thermostat housing we had with all the goo and crystals formed inside of it? It's got hoses all over it, which I'll take off, but I'm going to go ahead and leave all the sensors in place. Why not? It's a great test. I'll take it apart though. What else can we put in here? How about the engine mounts, AC bracketry, and engine spacer plate? Man, that solvent's incredibly funky. I'm just putting the dumbest stuff in here that I can, because now I'm making a pile of things on the floor, the stuff that went through it. Now what? Valve cover? Always do these face down or they'll fill up with sediment falling out of the solution. I need to attach something to pull it out with. It's too big for the basket. I just want to see what it does. And there's your valve cover. This bath is so funky that I had to slosh it around and rinse it, and I'll probably give this a second bath in a cleaner solvent. It's why I'm waiting for the front case, but sure, it's clean. Several times in this video I referred to this as acid, but that's a mistake. This is actually an extremely alkaline solution. It's got a pH in the 12s. It's not acidic, but you'll think so if you get it on your skin because it's still a caustic solution and they both feel exactly the same. Your skin won't know the difference. I'm rinsing it off with a whole half gallon of water because alkaline residues are no better for metal parts than salts or acids are. The valve cover gasket's still pliable, but I've already got a new one for it. Once again, all the RTV is still there. Further cleanup needed. Same kind of results though. Clean valve cover for sure. This is like the cylinder head's hat. Let's get back to actual cylinder head already. I know, it's clean, but I said let's get back to the actual cylinder head already. This isn't the only problem stud on this thing though. There are actually several. Some kinds of stainless nuts will seize on stainless bolts. This is a close-up of a set that did exactly that. I see your crescent wrench request, and I raise you one monkey wrench. This is actually the correct tool for this job. One of the best things that a monkey wrench is for besides plumbing is extracting studs. You must have no desire to ever use the stud again, and this is certainly the case here today, but the way the jaws are made on this thing, the harder you mash on it, the better it grips the stud. Saves you a whole lot of time and effort versus double nutting. It just destroys whatever you remove is all. Let's check the cylinder head deck, shall we? Factory service limit is 0.02 of an inch, and my standard is smaller at 1.5 thousandths. Split it, box it, exit, whatever. I'm gonna do all this stuff out of order. Same difference. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. So far, so good. I'm not seeing anything wrong with any of these tests. No matter what else I've found that failed so far, what I do know is that this resurfacing job is top-notch, if not one of the best I've ever seen done to a 4G63 head with loving care. Great job, whoever did all this. Your work is my time capsule. The head oil port relief. Let's measure that and see how deep it is. We've got 63 thousandths. So if 2 thou came off the head, it was only 65 thousandths to start with. I'd really rather see that up around 100 thousandths, and I'll fix that. So how about the bullseyes? Front one's got 28 thousandths. Other front one's got 33 thousandths. And the one in the back's got 42 thousandths. Now, let's verify the height of the head. 5.197 inches. Factory spec is 5.2 inches, so only 3 thousandths is missing. I'm not likely going to be running into any valve clearance issues here with this thing. There's a whole lot of meat on the deck, just like I suspected. I'm putting all the cam caps and bolts back onto the head to keep them from getting lost or mixed up with all the others. I do have 2 other sets floating around in this garage for 2-cylinder heads, after all. Yeah. I was rather disappointed with the cams once I had a chance to get a good up-close look at them clean. Whatever it was that grooved that camshaft bifurcated itself and left a double groove on the cam. I just wanted to use that word. Bifurcated. It means to fork. Yep, this intake cam is forked, alright. Let's look at that exhaust cam. I scrutinized it, and it too had some unforgivable markings tattooed into both of its lobes from a past encounter with the valves inside a dark crankcase. I suppose these may have been acceptable or appropriate things to wear out in public, and back in the day it was a different era, but times have changed and I'm canceling these. So add camshafts to the list. Good luck trying to find Galant VR4 camshafts. I'm not going to find these easily, and someone else cams is going to require their specific spring pressures, so the springs and retainers get added to the list too. We also know that the lifters were toast, so let's add a set of those. Excuse me, those are 110 now because inflation. They've gone up 40% in the last 20 years. I bet you investors are scratching their heads and thinking OEM car parts on shelves might have been a stable investment that they missed out on. They could have made a fortune on lifters. Really, the valves didn't look all that terrible after all, but it was the odd way that the seats were worn that really got me here. There should have been a thin margin all the way around the valve, but these have a thin margin on one side and a fat margin on the opposite one. This would indicate to me that either the seats were cut crooked or the valve guides are loose and allowing the valves to bounce around unevenly on the seat. I had the same kind of wear on the exhaust valves too. The tips of the valves were reground because when new seats were cut, it recessed the valves into the head and changed the valve install height. That pushes the tip of the valves up closer to the cams, and so there's a flat surface here at one time that when they ground them smaller. And if you look at the light reflecting, you can see some of them have uneven wear on the tips from the busted up roller rocker pads. This wasn't meshing right. Several of them had this bullseye wear pattern. One of them was rounded off on the edge, likely from having the wrong rocker angle, and I really have no desire to cut new seats here, recessing any of these valves any deeper. Instead, what I think I'm going to do is get a 0.5 millimeter oversized set of valves and move that valve seat back down the throat hole and lower the valve install height to where it should be. These valves are too old and beat up to cut it with the direction that this repair requires to go. I don't know if you noticed earlier, but often when valves get munched, the guides get cracked or broken as the steel valve gets crushed and bent into them. Typically you replace the valve guide, but I can see that it's possible or likely that the repair for this head was to cut the protruding part of the valve guide down flush. There's actually a drill bit that does this. It's actually a performance modification too, but it doesn't repair a damaged guide if they were damaged, and even on a good one it drastically shortens their lifespan to do this. The longer the guide, the longer the seat's going to last. It's like trying to shoot far down the range with a pistol versus the rifle. Which one's going to hit the target first and more often? I think these valve guides are why the valves aren't seating properly. So add valves and valve guides to the parts list. Don't forget the 5 roller rockers. I actually have a set of those, but if I had to buy all of them, we're talking 60 bucks. And of course it is. $1,320. Why does everything about DSMs revolve around 1320s? I don't know. That's just the head. That's just the parts. Don't forget that we have to have new parts fitted to this thing, and that's also going to take several other repairs to get there too. That costs money. That's why so many people choose replacement. Don't forget the block. It needs pistons and rods, boring and honing. That combination of parts is about the same price too. Many of the holes are up to 5 times beyond the cylindricity service limit spec, and that requires machining to fix. There's no point in resetting only one of these things to a 0-mile rebuild based on what we've seen and how deep we're in here now. And the damages that we've witnessed are like death by 1,000 cuts for these internals. It needs a rotating assembly and a complete valve train. That's what it needs. What we've seen is that I have basically 2 virgin castings of a JDM block and head that are still operational with their original parts after 30 years. Barely, but they're operating. The previous repairs delivered me a running driving example of a well-used and enjoyed car, but the internals are done and we've got an empty canvas to do whatever we want. The stock parts, stock build opportunities were what I wanted, but they've kind of faded based on our findings. I have every single stock service part that I need to repair it already because that's what I'd planned to do. But it looks like those of you who wanted the laundry list of aftermarket parts just won. I started off this teardown talking about the reverence and listening to what the car wants. Well, it pulled up to Jafro's garage under its own power, poured its guts all over my workbench. You saw it all. Everything's broken. This is what it asked me for. It brought itself to me, its history and all of its worldly possessions to my backyard, and it wants to run again like it did when it was young. I didn't want to have to do all this, but tell me in the comments if you didn't just hear it ask for the exact same thing. I'm eternally grateful to every one of my Patreon supporters who enable me to share these tools, my cars, these stories, and these experiences with everyone with this kind of detail. Please smash that like button if you're enjoying this series. You have no idea how much good it does for struggling YouTubers like me whenever you do stuff like that. It's a small gesture, and you can build giants with it. Seriously, click it. See how much bigger I look in the next video. Until then, stay tubed.